something crazy has happened. Journalists in the U.S. have started talking about getting rid of farm subsidies. And as a small family farmer in the U.S., let me just say, finally, it's about time. There's a lot to not like about farm subsidies. And the one that hits closest to home for me and doesn't really make it into the news is they just make our farm sector worse. Hashtag not all farmers, but a lot of the U.S. farm sector is just kind of detached from reality because of farm subsidies. A lot of good farmland in the U.S. is basically getting thrown away to farm government programs, not to farm things that people actually want or need to use. If you've ever wondered why it seems like our farm sector keeps acting like it does not understand the basic link between cause and effect, this is a big part of why. The sheer amount of farm subsidies and support programs and bubble wrap that we have for farms makes it possible to farm while completely detached from reality. Nobody likes to say that because then the people who are detached from reality get real upset with you. But here are the facts. U.S. farmers are blessed with some of the richest farmland in the world. A lot of it. And it's really easy for us because of all our rail and rivers and roads to export it to anywhere in the world. So the idea that we need subsidies to be competitive with farmers elsewhere in the world is, it's just bonkers. So why is a country that has some of the best farmland in the world still subsidizing farmers? There's definitely a lot to unpack there, but let's focus on how decisions actually get made inside the U.S. That is politics within the U.S. itself. And I don't mean let's blame the farm lobby. I mean, let's look at how we're thinking about it as the voting public. We have been subsidizing farmers for so long that the idea that you could just not do that feels unthinkable to pretty much everyone, farmers and non-farmers. When Americans talk about farms, we take it for granted that, of course, the government will always give farmers extra money, don't we? We never ask if the government should be giving farmers free money. We only ask how the government should be giving farmers free money. Nobody in the U.S. is asking, hold on a second, should we be giving free money to farmers at all? That's just unthinkable. Or at least it was until pretty recently. The U.S. farm sector has, frankly, shat the bed so hard that people are starting to ask questions. People are finally starting to wake up to the fact that today's farmers are not poor. Most small farmers in today's U.S. are millionaires with a six-figure income. I know that sounds crazy, which is why I've made some deep dive videos on what that means and how it happened. Check out the description if you want to see those. For today's video, what that means is that farm subsidies are not about fixing poverty. They are about keeping people in the lifestyle which they have become accustomed to. That's what U.S. farm subsidies are for. And Americans are finally waking up to that. So we're finally looking for answers on, hang on, is there life after farm subsidies? Maybe we should check that out. And one of the best ways to find out what life after farm subsidies might look like is find some other wealthy developed nations that used to have farm subsidies and don't anymore. How's it going over there? And they do exist. The biggest no subsidies king out there is New Zealand, a really successful agricultural country. So reporters in the US are finally starting to get New Zealand curious. So I already have in the works a whole explainer video on New Zealand and how they got rid of their farm subsidies and what it did for the country. But now that the news in the US is talking about it, I just want to do a quick little overview and make sure we keep that ball rolling. So I want to start with a video that was put out recently about how New Zealand stopped doing farm subsidies and their farm sector is doing better now as a result. And it was put out by Bloomberg, of all places. And I know Bloomberg is not what people usually think of when they think farm reporting, but I do like keeping an eye on the financial news because that's how you find out what the business people are saying to each other. And the fact that a financial news outlet is talking about what if we ended farm subsidies, I think signals a really important change in U.S. politics. And here's the thing. No, it is not because investors want to get rid of farm subsidies because then everyone will go bankrupt and they can scoop up farmland on the cheap. Investors love farm subsidies and bailouts. I mean, think about it. Farm subsidies and bailouts mean that if you are a hedge fund and you buy farmland, then you are guaranteed income on the taxpayer's dime. Investors love farm subsidies. The finance sector has been one of the biggest political supporters for farm subsidies. And super generous farm subsidies and bailouts are the reason that investors keep buying up U.S. farmland. So when a financial news outlet that serves investors, people who benefit a lot from farm subsidies, starts going, wait a minute, maybe farm subsidies are not the best idea and we should probably find a better way to do things, that's a really big deal. That's worth looking into. Anyway, that's been a lot of talking from me. Let's just look at this video. And by the way, if you're liking this video, if you feel like you're learning something, go ahead and like, subscribe, leave a comment. It really does tell the algorithm to put this out in front of more people and gets the word out. If you really like it, there's a Patreon down below. Either way, thanks for watching.
The United States will be taking a small portion of the hundreds of billions of dollars we receive in tariffs and providing it to the farmers in economic assistance.
It's become almost impossible to think of U.S. farming without government payments supporting it. And the U.S. is far from the only country that intervenes in agricultural markets. But it turns out that there is one country, New Zealand, that has gone a very different way with some unexpected results.
The government wiped those subsidies in 1 year, and the net result of that has been staggering.
America started down its path to paying its farmers back in 1933, in the midst of the Great Depression, when President Roosevelt announced the Agriculture Adjustment Act.
With the whole world in turmoil, even the united efforts of the farmers themselves would not have been sufficient without the cooperation of the government of the United States.
In a recent report covering 54 countries, the OECD found that, quote, agriculture support policies generated on average $842 billion per year in transfers towards agriculture between 2022 and 2024.
That's a really big number. That's because that's for 54 countries. When I first saw that, I was like, wow, that's more than I thought. That's for 54 countries.
Dan Glickman was Secretary of Agriculture during the Clinton administration.
Well, first of all, there's a huge amount of agriculture subsidies in the United States. I mean, it's billions and billions of dollars. I think that first of all, farm programs are complicated, and nobody understands them except people in farm countries.
So the point Dan Glickman just made here, farm subsidies are complicated and no one really understands them except folks in farm country. That's not even true. Even if you work in agriculture, even if you are a congressman and a congressional staffer on the Ag Committee, usually you only have a really good feel for the specific programs you're using. So people who grow grain crops are going to know their grain crop programs pretty well. People who do dairy are going to know dairy programs pretty well. Although, like, even folks who work in dairy, there's a saying that there's 5 people in the U.S. who know how milk is priced and 4 of them are dead. So that gives you an eye into how well understood these programs actually are, even within agriculture. The Farm Bill, especially, nobody really understands the whole Farm Bill. There's people who know specific parts of it, and that can help explain maybe why farm subsidy spending is so crazy. We don't even have a good view of what exactly we're doing. We just don't have people in the U.S. who really understand the entire package of farm subsidies, whether they're in agriculture, whether they're in politics. Nobody really understands the whole thing in any depth. So it's hard to get your grip around, even as an expert.
You have people who have to deal with them all the time, are largely the only ones that have been involved in the writing of them. But look, farming is a precarious, tough business. These people have to deal with drought, disease, floods, tariffs, geopolitical issues. To a soybean grower, China was kind of the salvation. We were exporting, millions and millions of tons of soybeans to China. And when the president announced his tariffs, they were kind of off again, on again.
So that bit about soybean sales to China, you would never know this if you talk to folks who do farm policy and farm economics, but the last 20 years or so have been a golden age of soybean prices. If you look at soybean prices adjusted for inflation over the last 50 years or so, the last 20 years have just been really consistently a lot higher than normal, because China has this growing middle class, right? You have people who want to eat more meat, and soybean is a really big feed ingredient. China doesn't have the amount of farmland and water it would take to grow all that animal feed themselves, and so China's been importing a lot of meat and soybeans. It's crazy because you'll see people making big announcements now about like, oh, China's buying our soybeans again. They agreed to buy, 10, 12 million tons of soybeans this year. That's what they used to buy in a month. And that was such a huge benefit to U.S. farmers because they say the best solution for high prices is high prices, right? More people start growing that thing. If soybean prices are high, more people start growing soybeans, the supply goes up, the price goes down. So the cool thing about China was, from a farmer's perspective, it was a bottomless pit of demand for soybeans. No matter how much soybeans the U.S. grew, China would buy all of it. And that went on for about 20 years until we shot ourselves in the foot with this trade war. The funny thing about agriculture is it really does have golden ages every once in a while, and people never really think they're in a golden age while it's happening, and then it's over. We're like, man, that was amazing. We were just in a 20-year-long golden age of soybeans when we could not grow enough and the price stayed high. That is really abnormal, and now we have deliberately shut off that market, and that's part of why you're seeing so much turmoil in the farm sector right now. We are just in a 20-year golden age of soybeans, so a lot more people started growing soybeans. So now we just have a massive soybean oversupply, which is, I think, going to come up later in this video.
The impact of that was for the Chinese to kind of cut us off and go to Brazil and Argentina.
China didn't cut us off. We cut ourselves off. Just a quick correction there. Other countries saw that China wanted a lot of soybeans and they said, we can do that too. It was our choice to stop being competitive in that market by applying tariffs.
And that instability that occurred as a result of that meant that a lot of grain elevators were full and the grain couldn't be sold. or the uncertainty of production in the next year or two. So it was you talk about a dagger in the heart of American agriculture.
A dagger that, for the record, we put there ourselves.
Around the world, businesses in all sectors are forced to adapt to changing macroeconomic conditions without the promise of government assistance should things go south. What makes farming different? In the Depression era, national food security was critical.
Okay, that's not true. In the Great Depression, the problem was farmers were growing too much food, so there's an oversupply, and then the price is really low. So farmers weren't making any money. At the same time, because the Great Depression was going on, consumers didn't have any money to buy food with. You had two problems at the same time. You had farmers growing way too much food, but nobody could afford it. That's a mess. And so that's why you hear people talking about they were throwing out milk. It's because there was so much that it was basically worthless and farmers could not get paid for it. I think it's really important to understand exactly why these subsidies came into being, because this was not about securing the food supply. There was too much food. That was the problem. And so from day one, a lot of our farm subsidies had nothing to do with food security. They were strictly about making sure farmers were making money. Let's be clear on that. The food security programs were completely different. That money went to consumers. That was things like the modern version would be SNAP, EBT. That was getting money and food to consumers. So if they had money, they could buy food. If they had food stamps or something, they could exchange those for food. Just so we're clear, farm subsidies, paying farmers to do things, has never had anything to do with food security. Those are completely different programs.
But America now produces far more food than it consumes.
There was a time that we thought that free markets helped discipline conduct in all sorts of places. Is there a risk with farm subsidies of basically becoming less efficient in farming?
That is a very good question. There's no question that farm subsidies kind of skew the economics, the market economics of agriculture. After all, if we're supporting a crop with government subsidies, then no longer is the market alone determining the price or the location or what you produce. And that is a problem.
So that's absolutely correct. A lot of times in the U.S., you'll see people grow corn and soybeans in places where it's not really a good place to grow those things. And the fact that we're paying people extra to grow those is part of why they're growing that instead of something more appropriate to the area. You're not going to get good yields, and so it's kind of a waste of money. You're paying farmers to grow the thing, and you're not going to get much out of it. So that's a waste of taxpayer money if you're actually trying to get more of that crop. It's also bad for the environment. Usually, if you're growing something in a place where it's not a good fit, you're going to get a lot of erosion. You're going to get water problems. That's a whole thing. You're tapping groundwater to grow corn when you could be growing something else, and subsidies are the thing that tips that decision. You're drawing down groundwater because of that. So yeah, this is absolutely correct. Subsidies encourage people to grow things that are inappropriate for that area, and that causes all kinds of problems.
And also it skews the differences between the commodities. You may be supporting corn more than soybeans or wheat more than corn or those kinds of things. And so that does create inefficiencies within the marketplace. On the other hand, we will probably never get rid of farm subsidies.
We'll never get rid of farm subsidies has been the consensus for a long time. They have been a core part of U.S. politics for close to a century. We've had 3 generations plus of farmers come and go that have never known anything else. So, of course, we assume it always has to be this way. I think the fact that we have outlets like Bloomberg saying, should we keep having farm subsidies, is a sign that things actually could be changing, which is great.
But what if America, or any country around the world, did get rid of farm subsidies? It turns out that there is one such country. In the early 1980s, New Zealand's economy was in trouble. Its main export market, Great Britain, had just joined what would later be called the European Union, and public spending was at an unsustainable level.
We were within months of being bankrupt.
Lockwood Smith is a farmer himself and a former agriculture minister in New Zealand. In 1984, he'd just been elected to Parliament for the first time.
By the early 1980s, the level of support across our 3 main livestock industries, if you like, dairy, beef production, and sheep meat or lamb, the average sort of producer subsidy got up to 30%. But for lamb, the producer subsidy equivalent got up to 90%. Basically, 90% of the revenue coming into sheep farmers' pockets was from subsidies of various kinds. And of course, they responded to that because they got more subsidy if they had more sheep. And our sheep numbers climbed up to 70 million. We couldn't export all the product of those 70 million sheep. We ended up turning thousands of frozen sheep carcasses into fertilizer because we couldn't, we didn't have the markets to export that stuff. Saw the writing on the wall. I mean, we were within months of bankruptcy, if you like. And in 1985, they decided action had to be taken, and they abolished in 1 year they abolished all those subsidies. They wiped many of the tariffs protecting other industries, wiped them in 1 year. I wouldn't recommend that anyone else should try to do that, but that's what happened here.
Part of what's going on here that he's getting at is agriculture was such a big part of New Zealand's economy that they literally couldn't afford to subsidize it anymore. So that's how they got so motivated that they just cut off farm subsidies in 1 year.
The aftermath was tough, and some farms went out of business.
Probably the biggest protests I've ever seen on the front steps of the New Zealand Parliament were that year in 1985. I remember the newspaper headlines, the roar from the hills as farmers, gathered on the steps of Parliament and all the surrounding streets protesting against the removal of those subsidies.
He brings up a really important point here. When you remove farm subsidies, farmers will get mad. They will protest a lot. They will tell you that you're about to destroy farming. And as we can see here, that didn't really materialize. So just because someone is saying, I'm a farmer, this is going to ruin my business, does not necessarily make it true. And even if it does ruin that guy's business, it can leave agriculture stronger, because if the only reason that guy's business worked was because of subsidies, he didn't have a real business. All right. So if you have people telling you, I was depending on this, they're kind of telling you maybe they didn't really need to be there in the first place. I am just here because of farm subsidies. So if the U.S. ever actually moves towards getting rid of farm subsidies, be ready for a lot of rage and be ready to sit with that and just let it be. Especially here in the U.S., again, most of these small family farmers are millionaires with a six-figure income. So farmers as a group are people who have a lot of resources at their disposal to buy ads and to take protest trips into town where they can just take off work for several days to drive their tractor around and protest. Those are not the signs of poor people. Those are the signs of people with a lot of wealth and power to make their upset heard. That's really different from you're causing mass poverty. I think it's worth putting out there. If we actually consider abolishing farm subsidies, be ready for a lot of anger. Be ready for a mess. That is part of it. Getting rid of farm subsidies can be very politically messy, but that doesn't make it wrong, and that doesn't mean it's going to actually destroy agriculture, as we're about to see here.
Peter Jex Blake is a retired farmer on New Zealand's east coast.
Yeah, I remember I was a part of a protest with the Prime Minister David Lange. A few of his ministers arrived and were holding up a bank statement. 18-20% interest rates is impossible. He said, well, change banks.
I'm just going to point out here, 18 to 20% interest rates would have been for everybody. There was a big financial crisis in the 80s, so it wasn't just farmers experiencing that, it was everybody. So you have farmers basically expecting special treatment because they're having to pay high interest. Well, everybody is, and farmers are also already getting so much of their government's budget at this time in New Zealand that the government and the country literally couldn't afford to keep supporting them. So he's basically admitting to, yeah, I went out to protest, things were hard, and I'm still here. So that's a fun story to watch.
They had no sympathy at all for farmers.
I always remember trying to save money in every way.
The immediate aftermath was tough. Although farmers did agree that there was a need for subsidy reform, they felt it was too swift and that they were unfairly targeted.
What happened was they sort of took the subsidies off before they did any other economic reform. So farmers bore the brunt of it for a few years.
That's not entirely true. He's saying only farmers had to bear the brunt of this. They were also cutting off a lot of subsidies to fisheries and other industries as well. And interestingly, when they stopped subsidizing fishing, people stopped fishing as much and a lot of fishery stocks recovered. So no, farmers were not the only industry targeted. Again, removing subsidies actually did a lot of good things in general.
Basically, your income halved, land prices halved.
That's important. Land prices fell in half. A fun thing that happens when you subsidize farmers is if you're giving free money to farmers, then the value of farmland goes up. You can make more money farming, so the price for farmland goes up because now you can make more money by owning that farmland and farming it. So something that farm subsidies tend to do is drive the cost of farmland way up, which prices working class people out of agriculture. Farm subsidies really distort rural economies, and that's not just because they get people to grow things they wouldn't normally grow. They also price working class people out of agriculture. And if you look at what's happening in the U.S. today, our farmland prices are way too high. That is a big sign that the price of farmland is being driven up by subsidies. That's a big part of why investment firms want to buy farmland, is because the price is going up and up and up because we keep subsidizing agriculture more and more. If we stop doing that, number one, investment firms kind of lose interest because you're not getting the guaranteed returns and growth in farmland value anymore, so they don't want to keep buying it. And also, again, more working class people can become farmers. farmers. This is a good thing. So what he's talking about here, if you're a farmer who already owns land, then having the value of that land fall in half, obviously that's pretty distressing, but it allowed people to get on better financial footing, and it made it possible for more people to get into agriculture, which is, I think, really underrated when it comes to keeping the farm sector alive and doing well. As folks leave, you need more people coming in. You need fresh blood. We always complain about how the average farmer is super old. That's because farm subsidies keep driving the price of land up, so you have to be really late in your career with a lot of savings to even start. It's just, okay, that was probably too much of a tangent, but this is another great example of just because a farmer's complaining about something happening doesn't mean it's bad. That's important.
Interest rates went through the roof. Inflation was trucking along 15, 16%. So because none of the other parts of the economy had been reformed, pretty tough going. Fertiliser use dropped in half. So basically just toughed it out.
The use of fertilizer dropped in half. That tells you they were using too much fertilizer before. I think fertilizers were one of the things subsidized before they stopped doing subsidies in New Zealand. So that means people are going to use a lot more than they actually need, and that's going to cause a lot of pollution. So again, all these things, these kind of listing as negatives, aren't necessarily, they're inconvenient for farmers, certainly. Even though these changes were really inconvenient to him, he obviously was able to change his business in a way that was a lot more survivable. He's now passing it on to the next generation.
The time from 1984, which is when the really hit the fan, it was 10 years really of not making much progress at all. You just you're able to gradually do some improvements, but things didn't really turn the corner until the mid-1990s.
But things did eventually turn a corner.
The result has been quite stunning, actually. It was hard initially, but the improvement in productivity since then has been stunning. Because you either changed what you're doing or you did lose your farm. You went out of business.
They were predicting a huge amount of farms going out of business. In the end, only about 800 farms in New Zealand actually did go out of business. So they're predicting this huge wave of farms going out of business, and actually was pretty minimal. They actually had a buyout. They said, we're ending subsidies, and if you don't think you can keep farming without them, sell your farm now. You're going to sell your land and your farm and your animals, and we'll also pay you extra. They made sure that people had a dignified way out. They weren't kind of like losing everything. But even with that extra buyout deal, only about 800 people wound up taking it. And just based on the numbers of how many farms went out of business every year in New Zealand, that was probably just the next 2 or 3 years worth of farms that were planning to go out of business anyway, just doing it all at once because there was that buyout.
Started introducing new genetics into our sheep flock because it was the sheep industry was affected most because it had the highest level of subsidies. They brought in new breeds of sheep to improve the fecundity, or the number of lambs that a ewe had, from being just one lamb to 2 and more. Today, we have more than about 150% lambing percentages compared with less than 100% back then. They improved our pasture management practices, so we got better utilization of our pastures. Because in New Zealand here, of course, all our livestock farming is conducted outside, just out in the natural environment, just grazing pasture. And the net result of that has been staggering. Today, our sheep numbers have come down from 70 million in 1984 to less than 26 million today. Yet the amount of lamb or sheep meat that we produce is pretty similar, not much less than we used to produce when we had 70 million sheep. And it's quite a stunning story. The productivity improvement in our sheep industry has been, since 1990, when the things settled down after the changes, productivity improvement has been 170%, which is, if every other industry in New Zealand had done that, we'd be a wealthy country.
The story he's telling here, if you look at, the 1980s, is anybody else roughly my age, when you were growing up, you ever heard something like, New Zealand's got more sheep than people? This is the era they're talking about, was the 1980s, when farmers were subsidized by how many sheep they had. That was their number one farm subsidy program. However many sheep you have, we'll pay you for each sheep. And so what farmers did was they had as many sheep as they possibly could. That was bad for the land because you have overgrazing. The land doesn't get to rest because the farmers are maximizing the number of sheep they get. Boy, there's so much wrong with this. In New Zealand agriculture, they refer now to those times as the skinny sheep years, which is exactly as grim as it sounds. The lambs that are being raised, because they're raising sheep to raise lamb to sell the lamb meat, the lambs are not getting enough to eat. They're skinny. And that is because of those subsidy programs that they had in place, paying farmers by the number of sheep they had. So this is why you have a huge sheep herd of very skinny sheep. And as soon as you get rid of those subsidies, it takes a little while to figure out how to do things properly. You had a lot of people stop raising sheep because they weren't actually a good fit for the land. They were raising sheep to get the farm subsidies, not because they were in a good place to raise sheep. He talks about improving the genetics of their herd, so they had sheep that would have 1 lamb at a time. Typically for sheep, about 2 or 3 lambs at a time is how many you want. Too many, obviously, it's not good. But if you have just one, for every single lamb that's born, you need one mother. So if you can raise the same amount of lamb with half as many grown sheep, that's a lot lighter burden on the land. And for sheep, 2 or maybe 3 lambs is still a safe and comfortable number of lambs to raise. Of course, the other big change they're going to make in their sheep genetics is making sure that the lambs get bigger. You know, they're not raising these skinny lambs. Some of that is how you treat and feed them. Some of that is just genetics.
They introduced new terminal sires to improve the growth rate of the lambs being born in the flock.
I love this part he says right here. He says, we introduce new terminal sires. Terminal sires sounds like a health condition. What this means is we have a breed of sheep that is really good at raising lambs. You know, they're healthy moms. They have 2 or maybe 3 lambs. So that's a safe and comfortable number for the mom to raise. When you're raising sheep, you want most of your sheep, all the ewes, all the moms, to have good genetics for raising lambs. They give birth easily. They don't have a lot of health complications. That's good for both humane reasons and for productivity. But the sires, the rams, the fathers of these lambs, you don't really need them to have like good milking genetics. You want something really different from them. You want them to have genetics for the lambs being born small, so they're not stressing the mother out, so her health is good, but then they're able to grow quickly once they're born. That's really important. When he says terminal sire, this is what he's talking about. The terminal sire is the ram at the end of the line. You're not using him to breed more rams. You're using him to breed lambs that are going to be sold for meat. So that's what we're looking for out of those rams, is those genetics for really small, healthy, quickly growing lambs. And he's just pointing out that back when they had a lot of really generous subsidies for sheep, they didn't really need to do that because they're going to get paid no matter how skinny and scrawny and unhealthy the lambs were. Once they removed the subsidies, for a farm to function, they had to focus on fewer, healthier sheep. So that's good for the land, that's good for the sheep, and it's good economically. Like, everybody wins. I know in the US, we tend to focus so much on bad agriculture comes from chasing profits. There's more to it. It's not that simple. And I think this is a really great example of how we think subsidies are relieving farmers from the stresses of capitalism and maybe they'll help the environment, and they often do the opposite. I fully believe in social safety nets. Guaranteed payouts to businesses, which is what farms are, is not a social safety net. Nobody should wind up in poverty because their farm didn't do well, but guaranteeing farms' financial success is not good for the environment, it's not good for the animals, and it's not good for the food sector. So those social safety nets and farm subsidies are 2 very different things, and that's the story being told here.
Agriculture is still a major part of New Zealand's economy, accounting for around 70% of goods exports. But it remains largely unsubsidized, and its farmers wouldn't have it any other way.
Biggest thing, you know, I guess for me as a farmer is I want to make sure we have markets.
Anybody else think it's funny this farmer in Iowa has a southern accent? That'll happen every once in a while. I was doing food safety audits in Michigan, and there was a 4th generation farm in Michigan, and the daughter had this Kid Rock-ass southern accent. I was just like actually from the South, and we have to kind of like tamp that down or people don't take us as serious, and it was just, that was wild.
So I would rather not have direct payments from the government. If we can have markets that will buy the grain and stuff from us, not have to depend on the government for and develop those markets.
Okay, so what he just said here, and this, you'll hear this from U.S. farmers a lot. We don't want subsidies. We don't want a handout. We just want guaranteed markets for what we're growing. You know what they're not saying is, oh, if people don't want corn, then I should grow something else. If people don't want soybeans, then I should grow something else. There is no sense of responsibility for I have a business. I need to grow stuff people want. The sense is, this is what I'm growing, and I want help to make sure someone always has to buy it. So this is how you get things like the ethanol program, right? The ethanol program is when Americans are forced to buy ethanol that they don't want to have. Like, people will pay extra for ethanol-free gas. That means it is a product with negative value. So people in the U.S. are forced to pay extra for ethanol gas so that farmers have a market they can sell into. This is what he's talking about when he says we don't want a handout, we just want markets. This is what he's talking about. We want the government to force people to buy our stuff, whether or not it actually makes sense, whether or not they actually want it. We want the government to intervene in the market to make sure that we're making money. We just don't want it to look like a subsidy. That's what he's saying. So by the way, we're probably going to hear a lot over the coming year plus about how we have to create biodiesel using soybeans because we have all these farmers growing millions of tons of soybeans that no longer has a use. And so what they're going to want to do is copy the ethanol program, turn our crop into fuel so we can grow an infinite amount of our crop, never change anything that we do, just keep pumping out soybeans, and someone has to buy it. And it's going to be coded in very friendly, we're saving farmers, we have to do this, it's good for the environment. It's just a subsidy that no one has to call a subsidy. And what we should be doing instead is encouraging farmers to grow things that already have a market instead of waiting for the government to make them one. Anytime you hear U.S. farmers talking about like, oh, I don't want a bailout, I don't want a Band-Aid, I want markets. Well, number one, no one ever actually turns down the bailouts when they say that. That's just a thing they say. And number two, they absolutely do want full-on government assistance. They want the subsidies. They just don't want them to look like subsidies because then people think they're not as much of a big boy. And that would be the worst thing ever. But they don't want to be a big boy enough to actually change what they're doing.
We don't want to rely on government payments. That's the last thing that we want to do. We've worked to try to eliminate that, and we want to try to create demand through domestic markets.
There it is. Yeah, just another guy saying the same thing. We don't want a bailout. We just want a market to magically appear through government intervention and make everyone else in the country pay more money for a thing they don't want. That's a subsidy and a sundress.
It's easy to think about a world where farmers don't rely on direct payments from the government, where we create products for the market instead of creating markets for the products, where we encourage innovation through competition. Dan Glickman says that what might be thinkable as a matter of economics may well be unthinkable as a matter of politics.
Every senator has large amounts of farm country and farm products and farmers, and they're a huge part of their constituency, and they have equal power. So the senator from North Dakota has equal power to the senator in California.
This is crazy. It's like California is not a farm state. California is the biggest farm state in the country, and they're being described as not a farm state. What does that tell you? The entire farm subsidy conversation is just completely detached from reality.
That's the dominant factor. Then you have other factors like the fact that Iowa has been the first caucus in the country historically. That's changing. But Iowa is, people go there and they talk about corn. Even Bernie Sanders talks about corn subsidies and doesn't really rail against them. And it doesn't matter what your political party you're in, Republican or Democrat, liberal or conservative. For the most part, everybody kind of talks about markets working, but it looks like we're going to have subsidies of some sort forever.
All right, it's time to wrap this thing up. If you are an American in agriculture who starts talking about how New Zealand got rid of farm subsidies, the next step in the conversation is pretty predictable. People start coming up with all these reasons that couldn't possibly work here, so we better not try it. These reasons are what other people might describe as excuses, and those excuses usually revolve around, well, New Zealand is just so different. We do different things, we grow different things, our climate and our weather and our soil are different, so we couldn't possibly learn from that. Which is just wild. Agriculture really has a habit of blaming soil and weather for everything, and it's not that soil and weather aren't important, but they're not the only thing going on. The human factor, how we decide to respond to our soil and environment, have a lot to do with it as well. And so chalking everything up to, well, the weather's just different, the soil's just different, the market's just different, is just a really quick way to dodge responsibility for that human element and kind of chalk everything up to chance, and therefore we can't possibly take responsibility for how we are choosing to farm in our environment, with our weather, with our markets. That's all it is. New Zealand is a very small country with a much narrower range of weather and soil and climate types than the U.S. And so if something works in New Zealand, there will be a part of the U.S. where it works. We also have a lot more things we can do. We have a lot more opportunities to reach economics of scale. And so my belief is that if New Zealand can do something, we definitely can. What's standing in our way is not going to be nature, it's going to be us. The U.S. and New Zealand just have a lot more in common than we have different. We're both wealthy, Western, post-British democracies. We both have a lot of temperate and subtemperate and subtropical weather. And the U.S. is actually in a very similar point in its history as New Zealand was in the 80s when they got rid of their farm subsidies. For most of its modern history, New Zealand had one big trading partner. They would grow food and they would send it to the UK. That was a huge part of New Zealand's economy. And then when the UK joined the European Common Market in the 60s or the 70s, all of a sudden New Zealand didn't have that preferential colonial relationship with the UK anymore. The UK started relying more on the rest of Europe and other places that were closer to it as a big source of food instead of this one colonial outpost on the other side of the planet, which was great news for the UK and put New Zealand in a really tough spot because they had their one big dependable export market and suddenly it was gone. And that's pretty much exactly where the US is right now with China. We had been selling so much soybeans, so much meat, a lot of pecans, nuts, fruit to China. China was one of our top food export partners, and all of a sudden that market is cut off because we cut it off. So in the US and New Zealand, the immediate response is the same. We need subsidies. We are suddenly in an emergency and we need government help to get through it. The problem was in New Zealand, agriculture is such a big part of their economy, they literally could not afford to subsidize it. Especially once they hit the economic crises of the 80s, it was just dragging the entire country down and they could not afford to subsidize anymore. So at that point in time, they decided to cut farms off of subsidies cold turkey pretty much in 1 year, and everyone predicted doom and gloom, and then it turned out to be actually kind of fine. The US and New Zealand have really similar labor costs. They're both wealthy countries with high wages. Something you hear from US farmers all the time is we can't compete with other countries that have low wages, except New Zealand's doing that. You know? If a country that's so small compared to us can make it work, we probably shouldn't lean on that excuse as much as we do. And before we close out, I want to highlight the one thing that is truly really different between the US and New Zealand. New Zealand had about 20 years of subsidies under its belt. The United States is close to a century. Farmers in New Zealand remembered a time before subsidies. That wasn't part of their normal. Farmers in the US have never experienced life without subsidies. There's some small exceptions, folks who grow produce have not had the same kind of support and have been a lot closer to a true free market. But most of the farmers in the US don't grow that. They grow grain, they grow livestock. Those are heavily supported by government programs. And they have been since the 1930s. That's close to a century. That's 3 or 4 generations of farmers who have never experienced anything else. So something you'll hear pretty often from the US farm lobby is that when farms fail, we're losing generations of experience built up and all those talents that they've accumulated over time. And I want to point out that this is the United States where agriculture's been subsidized for 3 to 4 generations. If someone truly cannot run a farm without subsidies, we need to be clear. Their top talent was mooching off the taxpayer, and that should not be seen as necessary to grow food. That's a talent that can safely go to waste. We should be looking for farmers who can stand on their own 2 feet. They're always talking about how fierce and independent they are. Let's see some backup on it. That's not wrong to ask for. And if they can't, there's a reason that I've been making a lot of videos lately about how we can get new people into farming. It's a good time to talk about it. Like any job, you should have new people coming in to replace the people who retire and not just count on heirs to do the whole thing, especially when it's heirs from 3 or 4 generations of experience mooching. That's been a journey. Thanks for watching. If you're still here, congrats on making it to the end. Y'all do good out there.